Welcome to Female Athlete Stories, a special series of the Endurance Drive podcast. I'm Katie.
And I'm Elena.
And this is our third installment of a new series that aims to blend the crowdsourced stories of dozens of female athletes in our network with our own perspectives and experiences to shed light on rewards and challenges that affect female athletes.
If you're just listening for the first time today, just a quick reminder on where we've been and what this is. We actually sent out a Google form to a lot of our community to get insights from other women on what they've experienced in the female endurance athletic world. And so we've been kind of grouping all those responses together and sharing stories. We grouped them into a few different buckets. So we've been in an intro episode, which was our first one, and we kind of explained what we were doing. And Katie and I walked through a little bit of why we care about this so much. And then we went into the female body, which talked about more relative energy deficiency in sport, eating disorders, body image, that kind of stuff. And then today we're going to have a community in sport. So and we have a couple more planned and maybe more after that. So we're really excited to keep this series going.
We are super excited. But before we get into community in sport, we actually have something really exciting to talk about. So if you notice in our last episode, we had to cut it off because Elena was trying to make it to a race that she had just told me she was going to go have fun at. And Elena won the Black Canyon 60K, which if you don't know much about the trail running world, that is one of the most competitive trail races on U.S. soil. This whole Black Canyon weekend, there's a 100K on the Saturday and a 60K on the Sunday. And she won it. So I was thinking maybe we could take a little bit of time to talk about that experience before we jump into our main content for the day.
Yeah, I'm happy to recap. It was a really great weekend that, as you said, Katie, I wasn't fully expecting when I was flying out on whatever Thursday.
Well, could you actually take us back to your mindset going into this race, kind of what the prep looked like leading up to it, and then how that shifted into your performance on race day?
Yeah, totally. So yeah, as Katie mentioned, for context, this is a really big race in the trail running world, or a really big weekend, I should say, because the 100K is on Saturday, and that's like a really big race. The 100K is so big because it is incredibly competitive. The top 3 women and top 3 men get golden tickets to go race at Western States, which is a huge 100-mile race also on U.S. soil in California. So that was a big part of it, and I was actually signed up for that 100K, mainly because I wanted to have a very competitive race experience and want to do the 100K distance because my goal race this year is a 100-mile race in a couple months. So I thought it'd be a great build. But then some things didn't go as planned, as things go in training. I'm sure we've all had those different journeys along the way. I had really busy last year. The last race I did was actually last summer, and I dropped out of it. It was my first race I ever dropped out of because I felt horrible. I learned I had really low iron and had to build back from that amongst a lot of other like craziness, moving and starting and ending jobs and stuff like that. So coming into this race, I was really excited to just have a good race experience, but I also got really sick from a parasite that I picked up while traveling in India over the new year that kind of knocked me out for most of January. And after that, I was like, I think I need to just have a good race and not put too much pressure on my body. So I decided to drop from the 100K and go into the 60K, which is still really competitive, just a shorter distance. So coming into it, I think my main goal was just to build confidence again because I had lost so much confidence in racing and it had been a while. And I just wanted to put myself out there. Of course, a little competitive drive where you always want to do well, I guess. And I wanted to be in the top 3 women would be like my A goal. I thought it was possible. I just didn't really know how it would feel. So going into it, I think I was just trying to get my head in a space where I was both excited to race, but also not putting too much pressure on myself because I just knew that I needed to get myself back out there. And I wasn't trying to qualify for anything all that major. It was just like a building race for me.
And how'd you feel about, did you look up the start list beforehand? Because there were a lot of competitive names in this race.
Yeah, I did. And then I quickly X'd out of it because I was like, oh, there's a few on there that are like, yeah, okay, they're really big deals. I think it was actually kind of motivating though, because I didn't have so much pressure on myself. I was like, wow, I wonder what it would feel like to run with these people. Like, I think that was where I was like, maybe top 3 would be like a big A goal because I just want to see if I can stick with these ladies. And if I can't, that's fine. But it was both motivating and intimidating. Had I been putting more like pressure on my performance, I think it would have been a lot more intimidating rather than motivating. But I was in a good headspace to not let it get to me too much.
Absolutely. And just to brag a little bit about Elena, a lot of these people on the start list and people she was racing were all professional trail runners. So that's a really big deal. It's a really, really stiff competition. So you start the race and I was watching on the tracker and basically every single ping that we got, you were in first place. There was really no jockeying going on besides you moving up so kind of through the men's field. So talk me through what happened when the gun went off.
Yeah. Okay. One thing that I think was really helpful that I don't know if I've done before was we were crewing all day on Saturday for my teammates who were running in the 100K, which was super fun. but we had a longer gap in the afternoon. And so my husband suggested driving to the start and doing a 3 or 4 mile shakeout from the start. So running that start really helped because I had an idea of how it would feel and how I could push on it. So when I started, I was moving, but I didn't think that fast, but not slow either. Like I was like controlled. I was looking at my pace. I was looking at my heart rate. Everything seemed very much in control. And I was expecting to run, like I said, with the lead women and just see how that felt. But then I was the lead woman because I didn't see anything. I didn't see any other women around me. And I was like, well, they're probably going to come up in a second. Like maybe they just are a little bit behind and we're on a dirt road now and they're going to kind of get going, because there was a section that was pretty gnarly trail really early on that was just like really muddy, frozen footprints, slow goings. So I figured that once we opened up on dirt road for a mile, there would be more women coming up, but there weren't. So then I just was like, well, I feel comfortable. I trust my body. My heart rate seems fine. I'm just going to keep this up and see what happens. And then I kind of fell in behind a group of men that were running a pretty good clip and felt good. So from then on, I just never saw a woman the rest of the race, except for on a turnaround, which was then really motivating to have an idea of where everyone was. But yeah, I didn't know for most of the race, I would say until it's a 38-mile race. So until mile 35, I didn't know where any of the other women were.
Well, I love your approach there. It's so gutsy to really go out and be like, you know what, I'm just going to run my race, and you race who shows up and the performances that they bring. And it seemed like today you really had just that best strategy. What do you think really contributed to you just feeling so good? It sounded like you were just steady the whole time. What were the factors that led to such an incredible performance?
Yeah, I think I wrote down stuff right after the race so I could remember how it felt and what I think went well and things that I hope to replicate more in the future. All of this is such a journey of like experience and kind of figuring out what works for you and what doesn't work for you, recognizing that, days like this are going to be really special and they could be somewhat out of your control, but there's maybe some things you can do to influence it. So I think a few main things stand out to me. The first is that I kind of hinted on it, but I just feel like I had the right balance mentally of preparation and feeling pretty chill. Like I went through beforehand and I had planned out like what splits I thought I would hit at aid stations to have an idea of how my race was going. So I was really more focused on my race and my time, and how other people hit times around that like didn't really influence me. I remember thinking throughout the race that like, man, I don't know when they're going to come up and catch me and go past me. Like they totally might. And honestly, I'll still be happy because I'm running a good race based on my times right now. So that kind of helped me stay calm. And then also because I was part of the community on Saturday, like crewing and supporting, it just took my mind off of my race and just got me all feeling the good vibes of racing and inspired by everyone out there and supporting my friends. So I was just having a lot of fun. And I think that got me in a really good mental space. And then I kind of will go through really quickly because I think it might be helpful, but I have like a planning note that I used beforehand where I wrote out my splits for my times at aid stations. I wrote out my strategy at aid stations, like exactly what I would need from my crew when I saw them halfway through. I wrote out what my general strategy for the race was. So I said, like, I'm having a gel every 20 minutes. I'm going to fill my hand flask at every single aid station to keep drinking my electrolytes. And then I said, I'm going to try to stick with the lead women and see how that pace feels. If my heart rate feels too high, I'm going to cool it back. That obviously didn't really play out because I was the lead woman, but that was still kind of influencing how I felt like I was racing. Like if I felt like I was going too hard, I would cool it back. But as long as I felt good, I was going to push it. And then I had a section that was really helpful for me. It's called mental work, or I called it mental work. And basically because I had had such a tough year and lost a lot of confidence, I felt like I had been saying a lot of negative things to myself about why I couldn't do stuff. And I wrote out that whole negative narrative. And then I took the time to go through that negative narrative and reframe it into the positive narrative that I wasn't telling myself. And just writing that down, I think really helped me get myself in a better headspace of like, wow, I do deserve this and I can go for it. And I hadn't been feeling that in the previous months. So that was, I think, helpful for me. And there's a stuff to remember section where I wrote all the positive things, like I get to explore a new place, I get to have fun, nothing really matters. Just remember that I get to show myself what I can do. This is more of a celebration. And then I had a section called my cookie jar, which is where I go through and write out all of the things that I have accomplished in the past that I feel proud about, whether it was a training run recently or a previous race where I surprised myself, just to remind myself that I can do these hard things and that my body has surprised me before. And then I just like afterwards wrote out what went well, like I mentioned. So that was my planning approach. And I just think it got myself in a good headspace where I was prepared, but I didn't feel overly anxious.
Have you always done this before races? Is that kind of your strategy all the time, or did you just pick it up this year?
I've done it in pieces before races. I think this was the first time that I actually put that all together, where I like did it on a single note, really focused time of just writing all of that down. I think I wrote it all down truly like the day before the race, or maybe 2 days before the race. So it was pretty fresh on my mind, where in the past, I think I've done it more slowly, which is not a bad thing. I think it's good to always remind yourself that, but I think I just needed that moment of focused personal time to do that beforehand. So maybe like newer putting it all together, but frequent in terms of how I think about it.
I think that's really valuable, and it's something that anyone can do. I mean, even if you're not going to win a trail race or finish in the top 3, if you just want to finish any race, everyone can work on their mental game there. So I think we might have to trademark that Elena method and give it to all our athletes, because it's so good. One thing I wanted to ask also about was, tell me about your fueling strategy. So we've talked about this a little bit, and you had told me that this was something that you think really led to an incredible performance. So how did you approach that in the race?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I would say there's just so much more research coming out about just fueling as much as you can throughout these bigger efforts. I have used this strategy before where it just works for me. I love spring energy gels, and I have also gotten into the precision hydration gels. And so I kind of mix those, but I'm taking a gel every 20 minutes on the dot. Like I just do it based on my watch. I'm looking at it, and once it hits another 20-minute interval, I take my gel, kind of like force it down, but I've gotten good at taking them on the run because I've practiced through training. So I was basically having, I think, spring energy is 45 grams of carbs. So 3 of those an hour plus all the Gatorade I was drinking. So I was probably up around 140, maybe 150 grams of carbs per hour, which is high. And that felt good to me. And I think that my stomach can handle it. So yeah, I think that was definitely helpful. I also, the previous day, we were out crewing, and my husband and I had made a whole bunch of pancakes in the morning, and honestly was just like nibbling on pancakes all day, like the Kodiak cakes, which I love Kodiak cakes. So a free plug for Kodiak cakes out there. But yeah, I think that helped. I was feeling really well fueled both before and throughout the race. And I think when you say 140 grams of carbs, it sounds really high to a lot of people, but I guess my advice would be experiment with getting up as high as you can, because I think it really helps.
Yeah, I mean, your results say that it really helps. So I would say that strategy, you really, really can't go wrong. But again, yeah, that gut is a trainable muscle. So the more practice is going to get you there. A question for you is, what's going to happen next? Like, are you going to, continue to do races at this really elite level? I know you have this 100-miler in April. Talk me through that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'm very excited too. I think it was just fun to have a breakout day where it felt like my first big, really high level result. I mean, my goal has always been to compete at a really elite level in trail running. And I've been building towards that for a few years. So now my big goal is to compete at UTMB. So that 100-miler in April is a qualifier for that. So I'm definitely hoping to qualify through that race. I've never raced 100 miles before. The first I've done is 100K, so it's a step up in my distance, and I think there's some question marks on how that goes from the fueling perspective. Like, I don't know if I'm going to fuel off of gels every 20 minutes for like however long it takes 100 miles, so that's a big question mark. And yeah, I think I'm just curious to keep exploring. So the 100-mile is a new test for me. I think 50Ks and 60Ks are always fun to do and good training work anyways. So I will be building towards UTMB, I think, is the big goal, and we'll see what happens along the way, and still having fun. And I'm also getting more into skimo, so I kind of want to do some more skimo races too, and to see how that works.
That's so awesome. Well, I'm just going to say right here, like, the world needs to watch out for Elena Horton, because she's going to do really big things. And I'm super grateful that we have a podcast together. So
yeah, thanks, Katie. You're really pumping me up. Katie's doing the same thing though. So we're all building over time, and watch out for all of us if you're putting in the work year after year.
Very true. Well, in that vein, I think it's time to transition into our main event for the day. So we said that our second big topic, last topic, was the female body. We talked about female hormones. We talked about eating disorders. We talked about REDS. We talked about body image. Today, we're talking about community and sport. So this is something that encompasses several different topics, but I think maybe we'll go through a quick roadmap of what those are and then dive into each one. So Elena, you want to describe the first one?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the main things we want to talk about was stuff that came through our forums of just pointing out differences between female and male endurance communities. So yeah, not meant to be good or bad, just like these are differences, and here's how we have to keep in mind as a female community how to kind of grow that positive aspect in our world.
Love it. And then the next topic that we'll delve into a little bit is women kind of experiencing being outsiders in these sort of male-dominated communities, because a lot of endurance communities can be more male-dominated, but then also being able to draw on other women as support who have made it into those communities. And then we also want to talk about some intersectionality. So sometimes maybe there's going to be these female athlete communities, but they are not always as inclusive as they could be on socioeconomic status, on race, on other dividing lines. So we want to talk a little bit about that.
And then finally, kind of want to close more wholesomely on the relationships themselves and how these relationships formed, why they are so strong, they mean to us, and how we look to develop those in the future.
Absolutely. So I think, as always, we're going to take some of the quotes that we got in our Google form, and we're going to weave in our own experiences and perspectives. And we are always welcome to more stories. So we will link our form in the show notes if you have anything related to community or any of our other topics that we can jump into in future episodes. So with that, I think we'll just start talking about some differences between male and female endurance athlete communities. And the big caveat that I want to start with all of this is these are really big overgeneralizations in many cases. There can be amazing male athlete communities or male-dominated athlete communities that have a lot of traits that we might talk about as being more common in female athlete communities, and vice versa. There's a lot of mixed gender communities that are going to be different, but this is just sort of what came out of the forms that we got. So I think the first thing to note is that sometimes male-dominated endurance communities can be really intimidating to break into because they have a little bit more of this competitive vibe. So for example, one person said, biking with my male friends who don't realize I basically am always at least one heart rate or power zone higher than them is frustrating. It's frustrating going uphill at tempo and feeling tired when your friends riding in zone 2 aren't willing to acknowledge it's more difficult for you and just slow down a little to accommodate. Even when I bring it up, they will only ride my pace for 5 to 15 minutes before it creeps up again. I find the majority of my male riding partners do this unconsciously, even if they are otherwise very great people. So here it's sort of this not always intentional vibe, and yet there are these differences in people kind of just gunning in the more male-dominated communities, which can sometimes be hard to break into as a female athlete.
Totally. Yeah. I think we mentioned a little bit on the female body episode, but there's a little bit something too of just like understanding some differences that women athletes experience that male athletes might not. So we had another quote that was kind of more funny and interesting. Said, I run so much colder than most of the men I do sports with. I live in Alaska and this inconveniences me constantly. I have to put much more thought and effort into managing my temperature, and I have a lower tolerance for doing less aerobically intense sports, like climbing in cold temperatures. I'm not sure that my male adventure partners, even the most attentive ones, fully appreciate how much colder I am, which I'm sure it's frustrating when male communities don't experience the same things as women, but it's just challenging to voice those concerns.
It is, yeah. And again, here, like, we don't really want to beat up male athletes here. It's not necessarily always something that's intentional, but I think we can always think about trying to be just a little bit more inclusive with asking how other people feel and like trying to not always be going exactly to how you feel and your pace, realizing whether you're a male or female athlete, that not everyone around you is going to feel exactly the same, and not drifting up into those higher power and heart rate zones, because it is good for everyone to go a little bit easier. It's always good to be in low zone 2 instead of, high zone 2 or whatever that is. So I think there's some big advantages to that.
I hit more across the spectrum. Zone 1 for the win too. You do some zone 1 work. Yeah, it's just funny because it just reminded me of another like funny debate that's been rising, is that men can pee much easier on the fly. So
yes, there's
been like a rising trend of men in trail races just peeing as they're running because they can do that, and you're like, what? Like, I don't know, just still go off the trail and do that. But yeah, like on a bike, it's just like making time for women to be able to do what they need to do as well.
There's honestly nothing more frustrating for me than when I'm riding with a big group of guys in the winter and we stop for a pee break and it takes the guys like 20 seconds to do it. And I'm like, I'm going to take off my jacket, and then I'm going to take off my jersey, and then I'm going to take off my bibs, and then it's this whole thing. And it takes like 5 minutes just to pee as a female athlete, which, quick plug for drop tail bike shorts, but in general, they could be improved, I would say.
Yeah, I know. Well, I actually now forget the brand, so maybe Katie, but there is a brand of bike bib where you can like pull down without taking the bib off, because that is the hardest thing.
So I have some. I do. Although one of the things I'll say about it is that you have to literally contort into the shape of a pretzel in order to actually get them down. Maybe it's just that I'm like not that flexible generally, but I'm always like, am I going to break the shorts or my back first? I'm not sure. Just to pee. So yeah, anyway, just this broader point is like, we could all be a little bit more inclusive to timing and pacing and all of that stuff between male and female communities.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that leads pretty nicely into just the general vibes that people have kind of expressed as being different in these communities. There's a general tendency for male-dominated communities to just feel more competitive and more focused on the stats and the times of these sports, where in vice versa, female communities have been expressed to be more supportive and more generically uplifting the whole person around the sport. So that was just something that we raised. I think I've seen that myself actually in, like, there's an example, like there's a couple of podcasts in the trail running world. One is like a bunch of male hosts and one is female hosts. And the male hosted one, it often talk about like sport and like the pacing and the times and some of the more competitive aspects of it, which is really cool. Like we want to be legitimizing the sport and it's growing in that way. But it's just funny, the contrast where the male hosted one, it's more talking about that, and the female hosted one, there's a lot of broader stories of doing this adventure, supporting this. It's like bringing on other women to talk about their experiences, just like a little bit more broad. And I think the point would be like growing towards a position where we're doing both legitimizing the sport and also having a lot of supportive conversation.
Exactly. And I think one tension that we see here is like, we like the idea that some female athlete communities can be more supportive, but at the same time, you don't want that to be at the expense of being taken seriously. So it's like, oh, it's all very supportive and we love each other. Also, we can run really fast. We can bike really fast. We can really excel in this space. So figuring out where that sweet spot is between, I think, the two polarized ends is probably what we'd be working towards.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting because, I mean, coming from like the backcountry or like mountaineering world, there are like formal stats on this. I don't have an exact number, but I have a quote actually from the Mountaineers, which is a Washington-based mountaineering group. And it indicates how all women groups tend to make safer decisions in the backcountry. And I liked how they framed it. For example, statistics show that all women groups make safer decisions and have fewer accidents than all men or mixed groups. Women are socialized to be deferential to men, who are socialized to communicate less and show less fear. And those factors play out in the backcountry just like in our everyday lives. And I've done a lot of backcountry education. And it's just fascinating because I like how they call it the socialization and why these factors come into play. For women, it seems that when you're in an all-female group, everyone feels a little more comfortable voicing concerns and making the safer decision. Whereas in all-male or mixed groups, it's much easier for men who have been socialized to show less fear to be a little bit more competitive and go after those big summits that like, we will keep going, and the women that may be in the group might not express that veto power because it's just more common to be differential. And I think that plays out in, of course, all of society, not just in the backcountry environment, but another example of kind of this more competitive aspect versus a little bit more thoughtful and supportive.
Mm-hmm. And again, like we're really not trying to dunk on male-dominated communities here. It really is the socialization that I think produces maybe a lot of these differences, but it's something to keep in mind and consciously work against probably on each side. I actually have two stories that are relevant to this. One of them is I have a friend who was running her first marathon a couple of years ago, and she was telling me that it was so wild when she told people that she was running this marathon because every single guy that she talked to was immediately like, what's your goal time? What's your goal time? And she didn't actually have a goal time. She really just wanted to finish the thing. And yet no guy could really wrap their head around the idea that she was running a marathon and didn't have a goal time. So they'd always kind of push and say like, well, there has to be at least some pace that you're shooting for or some time. When again, completion was her only thing, whereas that was not something that she was ever really asked by other women. They were more like, that's really cool. What do you like about marathon training? Or what race were you doing? Or, you know, what running shoes do you like to wear? Things like that. So again, it's okay to not have a goal time. It's okay to have a goal time, but making that the only reason for doing one of these events or the only focal point, I think is maybe a difference that we see here. And then my other story on this is I met one of my best friends up in Maine. Actually, I was living in Midcoast, Maine during the pandemic, and we met in the context of this group ride that was like the most mammal ride you could ever imagine. Again, mammal, that's middle-aged men in Lycra. And it was this 6 a.m. ride that happened on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it was an absolute threshold hammer fest. Like you showed up there and you have to hold on for dear life for a full hour or else you will be dropped. And I remember immediately being drawn to my friend because she was the only other woman in the group and maybe also in Midcoast, Maine riding her bike at the time. But the craziest thing was what the guys liked to do the most was each pick one of us, get in front of us, and then lead us out and make us race. So we'd hit a Strava segment, for example, and it would be like, Scott, take Ellen, Morgan, take Katie, and we're going. And eventually I think we realized like we could maybe just ride together in zone 2 and we could chat and we could be friends and it would be awesome. But we didn't even get to have those conversations for the first few times we rode together because we were always just being pitted against each other like bulls in an arena. And they got such a kick out of it. And like, yeah, I love to go hard every so often, but sometimes it's really nice to not make that the only thing that you're focusing on.
Yeah, that is so funny. Like that just seems like a very intense environment for like.
It really was. Yeah. it scared me. Every time I went, like I wanted to do it, but it was like race mindset, like cortisol through the roof every Tuesday and Thursday for the whole summer, which was a lot for me.
Oh my gosh. Wow. That really points out this example then. That's like competitive to the extreme. Well, glad you could also do zone 2 rides with her now and be friends.
Yes. Yeah. Now we don't really go to the mammal ride anymore.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. So I guess maybe to tie this whole point together of being male communities versus the female communities, we had a quote come in that just says, racing other women is such a fun, enjoyable, supportive experience. I feel like women are often not incented to be competitive in other parts of life, work being a main one. So having a healthy competitive outlet that also has very clear boundaries and doesn't bleed into your friendships with these women is very important to me. Love that quote. I think it just kind of hits a little bit more on why the female supportive communities that also can be a little bit more competitive are so powerful. And like we mentioned before, trying to work towards correct blend of having support and also legitimacy in sport.
I love it. Okay, ready to transition to the next topic?
Yes, absolutely. Moving a little bit more, and I think hitting on why those communities can be a little more intimidating, there are some women that can break into those communities and there's a little bit of an in-group, out-group dynamic. So we want to have a little bit more about women as outsiders and getting extra support from insider women and how we might go about this.
Yep. So we got one quote that can maybe tee us off here. Someone wrote in and said, there are so many incredibly rewarding things about being a female athlete, but the most rewarding is the camaraderie that women have for one another when doing badass things. When I first shared that I was competing in Ironman Mont Tremblant, the outpouring of love from the cycling and running community in my town was amazing. Other female athletes were taking me under their wing, inviting me to training runs and rides, and were genuinely excited to see me succeed. I felt the same energy on race day when there were only about 500 women in the race field. The support and pride that I felt being a female athlete in this space was electric. And I love this. I really resonated with this quote because I've had similar experiences. One of those was racing at the women's only Kona this year. And normally, I'm out there and there's maybe one or two women around me from time to time. And here, every single woman who was around me was crushing it. And everyone around me was a woman. And everyone was just so nice. You pass someone, they say good job. They pass you, they say good job. It was just a lot of like, you're crushing this. We're all out here together. And it was a very different vibe from anything else I've ever really experienced.
Oh, that sounds so awesome. I don't know if I've actually been in an all-female race environment before. Mm-hmm. That'd be pretty cool.
They're not very common.
No. Yeah, maybe that'd be something to promote more in the future. But yeah, I feel like we owe so much to so many people to even be able to do the things that we are able to do. But I feel very lucky that when I moved to Seattle and getting into the mountaineering scene, I had a friend who was a couple of years more experienced, had already kind of done the hard stuff of being in some of the classes with all men and feeling that negative vibe. And she really took me under her wing and taught me a lot. We planned big adventures together. And I felt I basically did all my big mountaineering adventures with all women, which was amazing. And I never actually had some of those experiences that felt a little more uncomfortable with male-dominated groups until I went to a couple more classes. I did one of my cross rescue trainings and I was the only woman in the group and it felt horrible. And I don't think that's an uncommon experience, but it was kind of a shock for me because I felt like I was constantly in very subtle ways with body language and with tone of voice being condescended towards because it was just assumed that I didn't know the stuff. And yeah, I didn't know the stuff because I was there learning it. I knew the basics, but I was at the class and that was just a very upsetting experience. So I felt really lucky to have had women who brought me under their wing and taught me some things and helped me do big adventures without having to kind of break into that community myself because it's really challenging.
Yeah, I'm sorry that you had that experience. I think it's all too common where you enter these male-dominated spaces and everyone's maybe a beginner in these classes, and yet you might be treated differently and you're perceived as more of a beginner or less able to learn and rise through the ranks just because you're a woman, which is absolutely not the case, not even close. I had a similar experience when I was first getting into cycling, and I did these group rides with this group called Upper Valley Fellow up near Dartmouth. And I remember it was a very male-dominated group, but there was this one woman named Fran who was amazing and was, I don't know, maybe in her 50s or something and had been riding for years. And she made it her personal project to make me feel welcome in this place. So be like me and Mammals and Fran. And she sold me my first road bike for very little money that she'd ridden for years. And she basically took me on the routes, made sure that I wasn't getting dropped, just made me feel comfortable, was giving me little tips, but it was never in a condescending way. It was more just hey, we're in this together. I can see you really getting to this sport later on, and I want to chart that path for you. And it's interesting because I think that also gives you this willingness to pay it forward and then reach out and be that role model for other women in the sport, which is something I've tried really hard to do, and just bringing yourself back to that context, I think it's one of the few ways that we can maybe break into more male-dominated communities is having that link or that portal to get inside.
Yeah, that's awesome. Go Fran. She sounds like an incredible person. Yeah. Oh, wow.
I know. She's the best. I don't know if she's listening, but if you are, Fran, you're awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, Fran. You really made a difference. I guess, Katie, on that vein, like, how do you find that you best go about paying it forward, being that for other people?
Yeah, well, I think this goes back a little bit to our earlier conversation about guys sometimes just not really knowing how to slow down or really do that easy intro pace for people. And for me, I mean, I just try to remember, like, maybe if I've done a lot of aerobic training and my heart rate's going to be like 130 for a bike ride or something, I should be at heart rate 100 for a beginner. I've really got to bring that down. And I've had trouble sometimes with guys just not being able to come down to a very, very intro level. But whenever I'm riding with someone new, I am absolutely going to pace off them. And then I think it's also just thinking about how you're delivering different types of tips and advice. I like to do the compliment sandwich. It's very much like, hey, your form is awesome. Think about whether you could maybe bring your knees in just a little bit, stuff like that. And luckily, I have a lot of opportunities to do this through coaching, especially the Dartmouth team, because I do a lot of stuff in person with them. And it's really fun to go out and teach people how to ride in a pace line or just drop tips about like, okay, like you need this type of chamois cream or all this different stuff like that. But it's interesting. I'm always seeking out more of those opportunities. And it's hard when you're pulled in a lot of different directions with your own training and with a million other things. But I just think back to how much that changed my trajectory. And I want to make sure that I'm doing that as well.
Yeah, no, that is so awesome. It is cool. I mean, with your work with the Dartmouth Triathlon team, that is an awesome environment because in college, like it's when all the resources and opportunities are just like right there in front of you for you to go out and try something totally new. And well, it just takes a lot more drive to do that as an adult when you're not in that collegiate environment. And therefore, I think it makes it a little bit harder, but still emphasizes the need for role models in these like maybe smaller communities or non-explicit like Dartmouth Triathlon, easy college communities to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's something I think I can do a better job of, like just figuring out how to make those connections in newer communities when we're all like have limited time and are busy, I think is probably a big goal for me in the next year or two.
Yeah. I mean, for me too, it's like the local running groups that I think are so awesome or local endurance or biking groups, like all of that I want to get more involved with. Like that's really important work.
So I think now we want to transition to another really great and important quote that we got that I think maybe highlights some of the challenges with this insider and outsider dynamic. So someone wrote in, I think people really like to hype up the fact that communities of women are super accepting and safe, etc. But I feel that it's really important to recognize that especially for women of color in sports, this is not often the case. I personally have found that in a lot of female-only or female-predominant sports communities after high school, I've often ended up either backed into positions of advocacy or DEI without wanting to, or ostracized for not quite fitting the mold of an easygoing, nurturing figure. And both of these experiences have caused stress to the point of affecting my training. Alison Dazier discusses similar experiences in her book, Running While Black, a fantastic read, and many other women of color say the same. I think it's really important that when we discuss women in sports and the challenges we all face, we also take the time to make it intersectional and understand the additional challenges that certain groups of women face, both in the process of doing their sport and also from sports-based communities. So I think this was a really, really important perspective to bring to the table here because, at least in my experience, just, being in New England female endurance communities, they largely have been a little bit more white-dominated communities. And there's not a lot of diversity, both with that racial and ethnic component and even with the socioeconomic component.
Oh my gosh, totally. I mean, I feel like that has been something that I've thought about often in my communities. Like in Seattle, I felt like it was incredibly white dominated. And even now when I think about ultra running or trail running, like there's just so few Black role models I can point to. And yeah, I just think that's so important because it's similar to what we talked about in the very first episode. I remember not seeing any women in hockey and I didn't know how that would affect me. And I thought I couldn't be a woman playing hockey. And now I think for any young Black girl growing up, like to not see representation in the sport is scary. So we really need to do a lot of work there to make it more inclusive.
So I think maybe we can just run through some organizations that we really like, role models that we really like, and resources that we recommend here because we can all do a better job just on working on this inclusivity. So first, I would really recommend the book Running While Black. I read it recently, and this was a recommendation that came through in our forum a couple of different times. And I think that just makes it really clear what these challenges are that especially Black women or women of color face relative to white women with breaking into these circles. We can think about there being this like original circle of mostly like skinny white men is I think how she puts it in the beginning. And then the circle might get a little bit bigger when you think about how white women interact with that. But then it is really people of color and women of color who often get left out of those experiences. So we recommend reading that. And then we also have just some organizations and follows that we really like that are doing awesome work in this space. One of my athletes started a nonprofit called Trail Mixed, and it's a nonprofit that really is just trying to increase opportunities for women of color in outdoor spaces. And I think they have branches that are in the Bay Area and Seattle and Portland. So highly recommend giving them a follow. There's also the Outdoor Afro Network, which has other types of meetups and advocacy work happening in the outdoor spaces around the country for communities of color. So really like those.
Yeah. And then I think I've just been inspired on the mountaineering side by how people are trying to get people of color more involved with the actual leadership development. So I was pretty impressed by Alpine Ascents, which is a big guiding group. They have a BIPOC guide development program. So basically you can apply into this with like very little experience and they will train you fully, which I think is the biggest barrier. Is like, how do you break in and gain those skills and then level up from being like a novice or an amateur to like actually having leadership and visibility and really being able to hold your own. So those kinds of programs I think are becoming more prevalent and we love that kind of work. And then additionally, we have some people that we think are good follows on social media. So I had written down Mirna Valerio. She's an ultra runner. She's also just so fun. Her content is great. She's in Vermont for the most part and just like such a good adventure stoke. I just think she's a really, really positive person to follow on social media. We have Leah Thomas, who's an intersectional environmentalist, and she's just more across the board of how to get more inclusivity in the outdoors. And then Sabrina Pace Humphreys, who I believe is a British ultra runner, but she was a co-founder of Black Trail Runners to get more representation in the trail running space, and the author of Black Sheep, which is another great read.
Those are really great follows. And I'd also add to that list. So Allison Desir, who we mentioned, she wrote Running While Black. She's a great person to follow. And then we also have Sika Henry. She's the first Black professional triathlete, and triathlon is very much a very kind of like wealthy white dominated space, but she's a great follow in that space. I also really like following Marty Fuller. I think her handles Where Locks Fly Free, but she is the first Black woman to have hiked all 48 of the New Hampshire 4,000 footers and is just a community advocate. So big presence in New England there. And yeah, in addition to these follows and these organizations, we'd say like you should be donating to these organizations and you should just be educating yourself on the issues that exist here because they're really important. And we should all be thinking about how we can make our own existing communities more inclusive beyond just bolstering these resources that still kind of exist outside the default in these endurance spaces.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point because there's one organization too that just came to mind that I fundraised for a couple of years ago called Girls Gotta Run. And it's actually, the whole point of it is to get girls in Ethiopia running as a way of building self-confidence and self-efficacy. And as endurance athletes, I hope we all recognize this, but the impact of our sports, it just carries over into life in such incredible ways. And I fully believe in kind of that development of self-belief and self-efficacy through these sports. And so I think that speaks more to why it's so important to make these communities so inclusive because these opportunities are powerful and I think they can change people's lives and we don't want it to be exclusive.
100%. So really good stuff there. I think now let's transition to our last topic for the day. I'm glad we've made it to all three topics because often we run over. But this is us talking about the relationships. So many people talked about just how meaningful the relationships that they have with other female endurance athletes are. So I think we'll read maybe a couple quotes. The first one was, I absolutely love the heartfelt, philosophical, relationship-building conversations I get to have with fellow ultra runners on the trail. What a gift to share personal tribulations and triumphs with other runners. Best community out there. And then one other quote, I love the instant camaraderie that I feel with other women who play in the mountains. Almost all of my closest friendships with people of all genders arose or solidified in the context of adventures together. But I'm also talking about the quiet smiles, respect, and support exchange between two female strangers getting after it. And all these quotes, I mean, we probably had like 20 of these to choose from. We just pulled a couple that spoke to us. But I think we both absolutely resonate with this sentiment as well. There's something really special about those female endurance athlete relationships.
Yeah, it's so amazing. I know we've both experienced it. And I guess to be a little philosophic for a second, I feel like I've thought about, well, is it because, you know, you're spending so much time out there on the trail or on the road, working a little bit, so like maybe your guard's just a little bit down. It's easier to have these authentic conversations in those settings because you're just so focused on each other and you're so in the moment. Or is it that it's a little self-selecting, that if you're an endurance athlete and you've spent time kind of doing these things, you maybe like have more time to yourself to think about life, and you're therefore maybe questioning some things that lead to deeper conversations? And realistically, I'm sure it's a little bit of both, but I just find it so fascinating of like, why are these communities like so strong? Why do I have such good conversations? And why is it so easy for me to make friends when I ask them for a trail run? Like I can feel like I'm close friends with them after our very first run, as opposed to like meeting for coffee or meeting in other settings.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually have a good answer to that question. And I think probably it's somewhere in the middle or a little bit of both, or different person to person. But I would say that even like having an identical hour spent with the same person, it's going to be a different conversation if we're going for a run versus grabbing coffee or doing something else. And I don't know, I feel like I sometimes get a little bit more just like light social anxiety in non-endurance settings, but I feel so calm and comfortable, especially like meeting new people in that endurance setting. And I don't really know what it is other than the fact that the movement and the flow kind of just calms me down in general. But it's something that I think I can get so deeper so quickly with people when I'm in that context.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And then maybe it's also like, I just feel like endurance sports are like, they're not glamorous. So there's no like false pretenses, or you might see me like poop on the side of the trail the very first time I've met you, and that's just very fun. It like brings down your guard really quickly.
Yeah. And I think also the act of doing this stuff together, especially with groups of other women, it does sort of exponentially build that confidence. I feel like since my early experiences in the wilderness and the mountains, even just doing most endurance sports were with men, once I started to do these things with women, I felt this new sense of like, oh, I don't actually need to be with men in order to hike a big mountain. I can actually do this with women. And then that type of confidence, I think, has also translated into other elements of my life. So I'm working on a grad program in political science, which is also an extremely male-dominated space. But when I'm in a meeting with, my 4 male advisors and I'm like, well, I did a presidential traverse yesterday and I feel really badass about it, it makes me feel pretty good in that setting because I have this confidence that somehow does spill over into other domains of life.
Yeah, totally. That's awesome. It is like such a confidence building thing. And I think one other thing that stood out to me in this, and I think we wanted to hit on, just like reminding people that even if you're just out there doing something epic as a solo woman or in a group of women, if other people see you, I think you're making a huge difference. It's not like, do it for yourself too. I'm not saying it's like the reason to do it, but I just have experienced that for myself where like I've seen a woman doing a badass thing and being like, wow, she did that on her own. Maybe I can go do that. It's like kind of an inspiring flywheel. Or I think one of the most rewarding things that has happened to me was I mentioned before that I grew up playing ice hockey, and I always felt like I didn't belong because I was in a very male and dominated environment. And I got a random LinkedIn message a couple of years ago. So this was like after I've retired from hockey. Like I have not played in a bit. And this guy had messaged me because he said that I played in a men's league game with my dad against him, like when I was sometime in high school, I'm sure. Just like hopped on the ice with this group of guys. That's like a chill men's league night. And his 6-year-old daughter had come to watch her dad play hockey. And she was so amazed that there was a girl playing that, was beating up on her dad. And she begged her dad to start playing hockey. And he messaged me to tell me that many years later, she was now, at the National Development Camp and loved hockey and had started and was crushing it. And that was like, wow, I never thought of myself as a role model in that environment ever. And here's an impact that I was able to have, kind of like a butterfly effect kind of thing. And I just think that's so important. So just know that if you're doing your thing out there, you're still inspiring people, which is awesome.
I love that story so much. And I think like maybe one of the things we're trying to do here is just maybe do a little bit of work to be role models that we didn't always have. You had talked about not even knowing that like women could really play hockey as women, or it had to be this male dominated thing. So I think if you're out there doing it, even if you're just going for a run down the street, like you are making a difference there. And actually one more story I'll add to that is I was at the gym the other day and I got these new shoes recently. I went to the running store to get new Hokas, and the only color that they had was like explosive rainbow. So I have these insane rainbow Hokas. And of the gym, and this mom comes in with her daughter who's probably like 6, and they walk past me, and the girl stops and she looks at me and she's just like, I love your rainbow shoes. I was so cute. I had this sense that she's like, wow, like, you can be glamorous and have fun rainbow shoes, but also be like lifting heavy and crushing it in the gym. And, who knows, maybe she'll remember this down the line, maybe she won't, but it reminded me that like fitness can take so many different forms and role models can take different forms, especially if we're just all out there doing it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Wow, I want rainbow shoes. That sounds really fun. I thought it reminds me like there's also just a trend that I really love where like people in racing are putting glitter and gels all on their face and like just being all sparkly and fun and just bringing this kind of feminine, badass energy into a very, very competitive environment. And I just love it. So
I always get a pedicure that matches my race kit before I race triathlon, and then we'll destroy it during the race. But yeah, it works. Okay, so last question I think that we'll reflect on is just how do we think about these relationships now in life and how are we continuing to develop them? And as I wrote this question, I thought maybe a place to start is just revisiting how we even got to know each other, you and I. Because again, it was like this connection at a wedding over the summer. We really had never had a conversation before in our lives, but like both knew that we loved this stuff. Both knew that we loved the book Good for a Girl. And here we are like bearing our souls on a podcast together. And we have plans to see each other on Monday. And it's really a super special connection that I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, absolutely. I so agree. And I think that question of how are we developing them now, like what do they mean to us in our life? I've found that while I have friends that I adore that are interested in a bajillion different things, including endurance sports, and I maintain all those relationships as best as I can, it is easiest for me to build new relationships within the endurance community in some way, shape, or form because those conversations are just so free-flowing. We just have the same vibe. Like no one really takes themselves too seriously for the most part. And I think that that is really powerful. So, I mean, getting to know Katie, like, I feel like that was an instant conversation thing with like, oh, well, we've experienced some of the same things. Maybe we've had some of the same troubles in our lives. And we both bonded over this book Good for a Girl because it was just such a powerful expression of some of the things that we hadn't been able to articulate maybe to ourselves before. And that conversation just sparked immediately. And then we're like, wow, there's so much to do in this space. Like there is just so much work that can be done to make this a better environment for everyone across the board. And when you have like that kind of shared experience, I think it really sparks quick relationship building.
Yeah, I think so too. And I'm super jazzed to go for a run with you on Monday. So I'm sure we will continue to delve into these topics when we see each other. But yeah, I think going forward, we do anticipate that the relationships that we continue to build, they might come from different places, but a lot of them probably will come from this community. And that's really exciting. There's a lot of potential for like, people talk about how it could be hard to make friends in adulthood. But I think if you ground in these communities, you know, the challenges that we've talked about notwithstanding, I think it's a really nice place to start.
Yeah. And there's also just something too about like combining hanging out with friends while doing your fun activity that you like to do. Like it's just, especially in the busy world that we live in with you're trying to balance work, you might have family, like all this stuff that's going on. It's just effective ways of hanging out with people and socializing. So it's probably also why it gets even more important as we age.
Absolutely. So we love community. We love women in sport. We love female athletes, all this stuff. And I think we did a pretty good deep dive on that topic today. Next time, we're going to go into some more challenges. So I think that here we were talking about some more uplifting, positive things. There were some challenges we discussed, but next time our episode is called The Forces That We're Up Against. So there we're going to probably revisit some of the topics we've already talked about and go deeper on some other ones because there are a lot of forces that are working against female athletes that we want to dive into. So really excited for that. Thank you for listening. In the meantime, please feel free to send us more stories and experiences to be featured in our episode. And yeah, give us some ratings and reviews.
Thanks, everyone.